Hello, everyone. My name is Ariella Wagner. I'm the founder of SunRay Construction Solutions, a national construction document service. We help thousands of general contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers secure their lien and bond claim rights and secure $10 billion a year. Today, we have an incredibly important webinar, a webinar that we've never had before to discuss retainage. Retainage, how do I get paid faster? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the absolutely amazing Alex Barthet.
Thanks, Ariella. My name is Alex Barthet. I am a board certified construction lawyer here in Florida. And today we're going to talk about how to get your retainage paid faster. So let's get started. On the agenda today, we're going to talk about what retainage is. We're going to talk about retainage on private projects. And then we're going to talk about retainage on public projects and the laws and contract provisions that govern both of those situations, all with the aim of trying to get it paid to you faster. At the end, we'll answer any questions you have. And with respect to those questions, go ahead and use the GoToWebinar chat box, which should be on your screen. You can go ahead and submit the questions at any time. We will read them at the end. Please do not include the names of any people or companies in your questions. All right, let's get right into it. So what is retainage? For those that don't know, retainage is an amount of money that is held back during the course of construction, and it serves typically two purposes. One, it's intended to create some type of incentive for the contractors to finish. Nothing is a better incentive to finish your work than actually getting paid. And the other, which is the other side of the same coin, that is to give the owner some protection in the instance where work is not completed and they have to pay someone else to finish it. They're holding back a little bit of money to allow them to do that. Retainage typically is 10%, but aside from public projects, which we'll talk about in the statutes that govern it, it's a contractual understanding, meaning it doesn't have to be 10%. Sometimes, for example, we advise clients, well, maybe instead of offering to provide a payment and performance bond, they can hold 15% or 20% as a way to provide some additional security and to have some give and take in the process. So don't assume that it absolutely positively has to be 10%. It can be any amount that you and the other side are willing to negotiate. Okay, so let's talk about retainage on private projects. So we're going to get into deep in the weeds on the laws governing retainage on public projects, but know that on private projects, there is no rule or law that mandates retainage has to happen, what retainage amounts have to be held, or how retainage is governed. It is 100% controlled by what is in your contracts. So how do you figure out what the retainage is supposed to be? You're going to have to look at your contract. So let's talk about some things to keep in mind depending on where you are in the chain of contracts. So obviously, as an owner, you want to try to hold retainage. Typically, that's 10%. But as I told you before, it can be any amount that you can negotiate, but the standard is 10%. As a GC, general contractor, you want to try to get early release of retainage as a provision in your construction contract. Obviously, you would like the least amount held. If you were the general contractor in an ideal world, you would have no retainage held. You would want all the money paid every time you submit a bill. Some of the things that we see happen during the course of construction or the course of negotiating a construction contract, people carve out things about what is and isn't included in retainage. So for example, it's not uncommon to see a provision that says that retainage is 10%, but no retainage will be held on the general contractor's general conditions or fee. So that's a way to carve out some aspects of the amount that's being withheld by the owner. Staying with the GC, one of the things you want to make sure that you always do is you want to make sure that any retention that's being held by you is a flow down to your subcontractors, meaning you don't want to find yourself in a contractual provision, contractual situation where you are being, where retainage is being held against you by the owner, but you are contractually obligated to pay retainage early to your subcontractors. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that retention to your subs is conditioned upon receipt of those funds by the owner. Now, the same is true for the subs in your subcontracts, meaning you want to, when you're negotiating the subcontract, you as a subcontractor want to try to get retainage released early. And if you have subcontracts, you want to make those, the retainage due to them, conditioned on your receipt of those retention funds by the contractor. So let's take a look at a sample contract provision on getting retainage released early. So this is a provision designed for a subcontract favorable to a subcontractor. And it reads, half of subcontractor's retainage shall be paid when subcontractor has completed half of its work, and at substantial completion of subcontractor's work, all but the lesser of 1% or the value of any incomplete and punch list work shall be paid to contractor. Final payment shall be made to subcontractor at completion of its punch list. So as this provision describes, it says that you are entitled to, as a subcontractor, half of your retainage when you are halfway through the project. Now, these are relatively common but arbitrary milestones. You could say that you want half your retainage at 50%, and then another 50% of your retainage at 80%. So just know that contractually you can agree to whatever you want as long as you get the other side to agree and it shows up as part of your or in your construction contract. Now, if your contract is silent on the release of retainage, then much more likely than not, your retention is going to be held 100% until full and final completion. So what does that mean? That means that if your contract says that they're going to hold retainage, but it has no early retainage release provision, then that 10% is going to be held until the very, very end of the job. So it should be an item that you are actively negotiating, just like you're negotiating the scope and the price and the schedule. Actively negotiating when retention is released is very important. What we typically see on the subcontractor side is that contractors are more than happy to release retainage to you so long as it's released to them by the owner. So as I indicated earlier, they will almost always make it a condition of payment to you, meaning the payment to them by the payment to the contractor by the owner of retention is a condition of the contractor paying you your retention as a subcontractor. So that is not an unreasonable request. What you want to marry that with, if possible, is an obligation for them to ask the owner so that you can increase the likelihood that it happen, so that they have to make the request that retention is drawn down. So that's retainage on private projects. Let's talk about public projects. Unlike private projects where there are no laws, for Florida construction projects, there are very specific provisions that deal with the release of retention. In 2000, the law was changed. The old law used to be that you would be able to get half of your retention when you were halfway through the project. So you would reduce retention from 10% to 5%. That changed with a recent amendment to various statutes. to now a flat 5% throughout the life of the project, so long as the project is in excess of $200,000. Meaning that any project that was advertised for bid or entered into by any government entity after October 1st, 2020 has a flat 5% retention throughout the course of the project. So this is great news actually, because it significantly reduces the amount of retention being held from the outset of the project. You know, reducing retention from 10% to 5% is great. It makes a big difference in a contractor's cash flow, and that flows down to all of the subs and sub trades as well. What it does do, though, is it repeals the ability for the contractor to request half of the retention at halfway, at 50% completion, meaning that because now it's 5% instead of 10%, you don't get the opportunity to reduce it from 5% to 2.5% at 50%. So it's going to stay 5% from the beginning of the job to the end of the job. That's, you know, that's the give and take with that statute. It also prevents the holdback of more than 5% when you have to pay your subs. So the law requires that retention holdback of 5% applies not just to the GC, but to all of its subcontractors as well. So this applies to every state and local government construction project in the state of Florida. There are certain very, very limited exceptions. They're so insignificant that they're quite frankly not even worth talking about. But do know that this does not apply to FDOT projects. So this 5% does not apply to FDOT projects, which are governed by Chapter 337 of the Florida statutes. Now, once a project has reached substantial completion, on projects over $10 million, retainage is due within 30 days. However, for projects over $10 million, retainage is due in 30 days unless it's extended by contract, meaning your contract can require that it be held longer, but it can never exceed 60 days. And then on top of that, the municipal authority, to the extent a good faith dispute exists, can withhold up to 150% of the value of the work to be completed. So it gives them an opportunity to continue to hold back some portion of the retainage so long as there is some type of dispute related to incomplete punch list or work that they are not satisfied with. Now, if you're a GC, once you've received retainage, you must pay your subs that retainage within 10 days. And if you're a subcontractor and you've received that retainage payment from the GC, you have to make that payment within 7 days. And the failure to make these timely payments along the chain, whether that's from the municipal authority to the GC, or from the GC to the sub, or the sub to the sub-sub or supplier, the party that has been aggrieved has the opportunity to make a claim for up to 1% per month of additional interest. So even if your contract says that you're only entitled to 1% a year of interest, with respect to this retainage that's being withheld in violation of the statute, you're entitled to 1% per month. I've been doing this a long time. It's very rare that anyone is going to get so animated over the unpaid amount that they're going to actually demand and get paid this 1%. That being said, you know, if it's been withheld long enough and it's a significant amount of money, it could add up to real dollars. While not able to change the foregoing as a GC, as a sub, adding early retainage release in your contracts on a public job is still very, very important. So No, as a GC, you are governed by the provisions in this statute. So the municipal authority has to comply with those rules. And even if you're a sub, they still have to comply with those rules with the GC. But that doesn't mean that you can't negotiate something potentially better as a sub. So for example, if you're a sub on a public project, you may want to try to include in your contract with the GC earlier release of retainage, so even less than the 5%. It may not work, but if you get it put in your contract, and that's a contract provision between you and the GC, even though they may not be entitled to their retainage, they're technically obligated to pay you. Again, it's pretty rare that we see a GC find himself in the pinch of having to pay subs because they always make it conditioned on receipt by the owner. But having a contract provision is always very helpful if you can. So with that, Ariella, do we have any questions?
We do not have any questions. And I know that it was briefly discussed, but one of the things that I think is very important is, you and I see this all the time. When you start your contract, this really all can impact you, when you begin your project. So what would you say the best business legal practices are for the audience out there on how to communicate effectively with the general contractors or the subs on your terms, so this doesn't become a major issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the answer to that question is to be transparent with the general contractor about why you want the early release of retainage, number one. And number two, it depends heavily on where you fall within the chain of contracts. And let me give you an example. If you are a subcontractor on a project and your work is early on this project, so let's say you're the foundation contractor, right? So you're going to put in you're going to excavate and put in the foundation, then you're going to leave. And for the next 10 months, other people are going to be working on this job and you don't have anything to do. That means up to 10% of your money is just sitting there that you can't get. Explaining that to the contractor and the owner is very reasonable. Hey, look, I'm going to do $1 million worth of work. You're going to hold $100,000, and then your job isn't going to be done for another 10 months after I'm gone. You can check to see that my work is okay, and I'm okay with you holding a little bit, but you should really release my money, my retainage, when I'm done, when I am substantially complete, not when the whole project is substantially complete. That's the negotiation tactic that we use when we're asked to negotiate for our clients with respect to early release of retainage provisions. And most people are pretty receptive to it. It's rare that we find someone that says, no, absolutely not. We want to hold all of your money until the end of the job, even though you were done 10 months ago. That's a pretty unreasonable position. You may not get all of your retainage. Maybe they'll reduce it substantially, but not completely. But you're still better off than where you were, letting them hold retainage to the end. And again, I go back to what I said before, which is to the extent you do not negotiate a contract provision to allow for early release of retention, more likely than not, you're going to have to wait till the very end of the job to get your retention. So,
sorry,
go ahead.
please. Another big question that comes across a lot for people, so they're on a project and they're done with their job and they're owed $50,000 and their retainage is obviously 10%. The question always is, well, what do we lien for? Do we lien for the full amount, or do we lien? And that's question one. And number two, a lot of people say, well, Ariella, according to my contract, I have this retention, and am I even allowed to lien? And that's come up all the time, and I know the answer, but I'd love for you to express, your legal opinion.
So if you have lien rights, your lien rights are governed by Chapter 713, and they're very clear that you must lien no later than 90 days from your last work, and that lien amount must include all amounts that are due. There are certain exceptions if you are owed exclusively retention, whether it's a public job on a public bonded job or a private job. but most of the time we find that it's retention and a little bit of something else. Maybe it's unpaid change orders, unpaid contract balance. So our advice is that you need to lien for everything, and you need to do it timely, no later than 90 days from your last work, because you run a significant risk if you do not lien for those amounts and the 90 days comes and goes and you haven't been paid. You may get paid even without a lien. Maybe you were always going to get paid. But if something goes wrong and you haven't recorded a lien, you run a significant risk that you won't be paid.
Absolutely. I can't stress that what you're obviously the law is the law, but it's very important for all of the listeners to understand that even though you're owed the retainage, you can still lien the properties. And not only should you do what you need to do to protect yourself, you need to make sure that you communicate effectively with your general contractor that you will take the action needed. So I just want to make sure that the listeners, there is a question, I know I asked another one, what constitutes substantial completion?
So that's usually defined in one of two ways. Sometimes the contract has its own definition of what substantial completion is. But the general rule is that substantial completion of a project is where the owner has beneficial use of the property as it was intended. So if you were building out a restaurant and they're able to occupy and operate the restaurant, and even though maybe not everything is done, maybe you still have to provide a few pieces here and there, there's some punch list left to do, you would have achieved substantial completion.
Okay, great. If anyone else has any more questions, our contact details are below. We understand at least this is subject matter that comes up every other day for SunRay customers. You will all receive a copy of this presentation in your emails. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us at any time. And as always, Alex, thank you so much for doing such a brilliant job.
No problem. Before we leave, let's talk about two other things. If you are curious about the lien law, we have a podcast that comes out every week. It's called the Lien Zone Podcast. So you can go to the lienzonepodcast.com and subscribe to it. We talk about liens, bonds, contracts, and collections issues. And then we do these webinars every month. So the next webinar is next month in July. And it's titled, Your Lien is Worthless When You Do Tenant Build-Out Work, or Is It? We talk about some of the risks that you will have to deal with when you do tenant build-out work and why your lien may in fact be worthless, and some of the things that you can do to try to create some leverage so that it's not worthless. And then in August, we have, oh shit, I forgot my notice to owner. What do I do now? We're going to talk about all of the other ways to protect your lien rights, even if you forget your notice to owner. And there are certain exceptions that you can use that may give you lien rights even if you didn't send a notice to owner. And then we'll talk about the other legal ways you have to get paid, even if by some chance you don't have lien rights. You can sign up for all of the rest of the year's webinars right now if you go to sunraynotice.com/webinars so that you don't miss any for the rest of the year. And with that, Ariella, we are officially done. Here's our contact information. If you have any further questions, just send us an email. We'll be happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex, and wishing everyone a sunny day.
Goodbye, everybody.